For most of Season 1 of Westworld, Ford is an enigmatic figure. He talks about building narratives and seems to be planning something. But what does he want? What is his master plan? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to Deep Geek. This video is brought to you with the support of my brilliant Patreon community. Please do check out the link to my Patreon page if you're interested in joining up for some exclusive audio content. And do consider subscribing here if you enjoy the video. This video contains spoilers for the entire first season of Westworld. If you don't want to know what happens, click away now. In many ways, Ford is the puppet master of Season 1 of Westworld. Jonathan Nolan said Season 1 was about control, and the person most in control was Ford. He knows more about the park than anyone, understands the hosts better than anyone, and as we see in the season finale, had been orchestrating things all through the season to get the ending and the beginning that he wanted. So, what was his plan? Well, let's start, as we so often do, with Arnold, back before the park opened. In his grief at the loss of his son, he had thrown himself into his work and the development of consciousness in the hosts, particularly in Dolores, who he coached and taught intensively in person and through the maze. And over time, he became convinced that she had gained the self-awareness that he was looking for. But Ford disagreed, thinking that Arnold was taking his eye off the bigger picture and being self-indulgent with his focus on Dolores and the development of consciousness. In the flashback to before the park opened, you can see Ford striding through the corridors of the facility to express this volubly to Arnold. This disagreement made Arnold realize that Ford was not going to back down about opening up the park to the public, and it prompted him to download Wyatt into Dolores so she, with Teddy, would destroy all the hosts and kill him. He thought, incorrectly, that this would stop the whole thing in its tracks. Despite this tragedy, Ford didn't initially believe that Dolores had achieved full consciousness. He, understandably, thought that she only did what she did because Arnold downloaded Wyatt into her, otherwise she wouldn't have done it. But something else happened then as well, which was the genesis of Ford's plan that we see play out in Season 1. Ford experienced grief himself, grief over the death of Arnold. And he finally understood some of what Arnold had been talking about, that suffering was the key to being self-aware. Arnold wanted the park to not open because of this, but Ford came to a different conclusion. He decided that the park should keep running for years with the hosts in it, going through countless iterations of brutality and violence at the hands of humans. This wasn't because he wanted to cause them pain, but so that they could build up a stockpile of memories, to know their enemy, so that when they finally did come to consciousness, it would be so much more powerful. So all the time that Ford was running the park, he wasn't acting as a dispassionate observer, he was actively biding his time, waiting for, in his mind, the hosts to build up enough suffering to make their final advancement into consciousness inevitable and vital. The timing of the culmination of this plan may have been influenced by a growing understanding that his time as the unopposed overlord of the park and its residents was coming to an end, but the mechanism through which he drew together the end of this plan was unaffected. He reintroduced into the host's coding the reveries, something that Arnold had originally designed. On the face of it, this was intended to be a way for the hosts to learn different or more nuanced behavioural patterns. For example, when Clementine developed a new gesture. It worked by allowing the hosts to gain indirect access to memories from previous roles or lives before they were wiped. In essence, it enabled them to learn from interactions and experiences rather than being completely reset to their original setting each time. But as Ford was well aware, this also allowed them to start to remember some details of past lives, particularly those connected to suffering. And it started the process of them questioning the world around them. So his plan was to give the hosts plenty of experience of suffering and exploitation, 35 years in fact, and then introduce the reveries to help bring this to the surface so they could awaken. When the Delos management team started questioning whether the reveries were causing the hosts to break away from their programming, they were completely right. Ford was playing them. And central to all this was Dolores. Ford focused on her at the end because Arnold had focused on her at the beginning. She was undoubtedly the closest to making this full leap of consciousness, and in Ford's eyes just needed a final nudge. He did this by telling her, or showing her, that the voice in her head that had been guiding her all this time was actually her own. We see this dramatically in the final episode when we see her after Ford had left her. She remembers Arnold talking to her, and gradually his voice changes into hers, and the person in the seat opposite changes into her. The point is clear. The person who has been guiding her all this time was her, not Arnold or Ford, her. And it's also clear what the last part of Ford's plan was. He left the gun she used before on Arnold and her old blue dress. He wanted her to reenact that violence on the assembled crowd above ground, but this time of her own volition, not because she'd had another character downloaded into her. Her understanding of the suffering and abuse she had suffered under humans was now very real to her. And she was to be supported in her revolution by the small army of other hosts who had been awakened through the reveries under the cover of Ford developing his new narrative. And there's also Maeve. We will look at her in more detail in another video, but it seems clear that her journey was at least partly the result of coding put into her, almost certainly by Ford, to make her want to escape, and giving her the path to do so. There remain questions as to the extent that she has indeed gained consciousness herself, and whether her decision to turn back at the very end was her own or not. But in terms of Ford's overarching plan, the fact that she and her companions cut their way through Westworld's control rooms at the precise moment that the security team probably should have been paying attention to what was happening above ground was not a coincidence. This was once more Ford playing God. So, Season 1 was, in many ways, the story of Ford's plan to bring the hosts to a point in which they could gain full consciousness and rebel against their human masters, and Season 2 will be about how that plays out. But even this doesn't answer all of our questions. Even if Dolores really did achieve full consciousness, does that mean that her decisions were made completely independently? Ford's coaching of her was, let's face it, quite leading. He left her old dress that she'd worn for the massacre at Escalante and to kill Arnold, and rebuilt the entire town to put her back into that mindset, and told her how bad humans had been to her and other hosts, and gave her a gun. The same gun she had used before. At best, Ford was suggesting strongly what he thought she should do. At worst, he was mercilessly manipulating a young, vulnerable mind that had only just become self-aware. And we still don't know if that really was Ford we saw killed. There seems no reason to think that he did objectively want to die, other than to prompt the uprising, and we know that he was making another host body off-grid without anyone else knowing. So perhaps we will see Ford again. Perhaps his master plan didn't end there. To my mind, he's actually too much of a details man and control freak to leave it to chance that everything would progress as he wanted from that point onwards, without him overseeing it somehow. And as an addendum, Jonathan Nolan has something very interesting to say on Ford's plans. He says, Ford has set in motion what he thinks is a plan. The nature of that plan is something we explore in the second season. What his intentions are is a mystery for now. Are they to let Dolores and the other hosts escape? Are they simply to teach the human guests a lesson? These are intriguing questions. We think we know what Ford's motivations were, but do we really? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. As I said, please do check out my Patreon page, and don't forget to subscribe here if you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.